humans.
Hmm.
We build these, astonishing structures,
Yeah.
create breathtaking art, perform acts of just profound grace and kindness.
Hmm.
And yet we're also capable of shocking brutality, organized violence, even genocide. It's really the ultimate paradox of our species, isn't it?
It really is. And figuring out where that incredible spectrum of behavior actually comes from, well, that's one of the oldest questions there is, I think.
Absolutely. Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your sources, and today it's a stack of material diving deep into the biology of human behavior.
Right.
And we try to pull out the most important, maybe the most surprising and insightful nuggets for you.
And our mission today really is to peel back the layers, to look at why humans do what they do, not just from, one single angle, but across every level we can possibly explore from these sources.
Yeah, we're going to go from what's happening in your brain milliseconds before you act.
All the way back to events that unfolded months or even thousands and thousands of years ago, shaping our evolution, shaking our cultures.
And the real intellectual challenge, I think, in digging through this material is constantly thinking in this really interconnected way, seeing the biology, the environment, the history, all influencing each other.
And, well, let's be honest, making sense of humans as animals. Trying to figure out when our behavior is driven by the same fundamental forces you see in other species and when something genuinely different is going on.
Okay, let's just jump right in with that exact idea. We are animals, too. The material really hammers this home, how much fundamental biology we share.
It's pretty striking when you lay it out. I mean, when you feel stressed, you're secreting the exact same stress hormone as, say, a scared little fish being chased.
Right, and the brain pathways involved in pleasure, in reward.
They're essentially the same in us as they are in, well, the source mentions a capybara.
A capybara.
Ah.
And even down at the cellular level, our neurons work fundamentally the same way as neurons in, a brine shrimp.
Yeah. A brine shrimp, yeah. And there's even that intriguing finding, sometimes called the Wellesley effect, suggesting human female menstrual cycles can synchronize, which is a really well-documented thing in female rats. These aren't just, random coincidences. They point to a deep, shared evolutionary past.
And the overlap isn't just in the nice stuff either. When it comes to violence, the actual physical actions, the motoric features, as the sources call them,
right,
they can look identical to what you might see in some other apes.
Right.
Pummeling, cudgeling, throwing rocks, killing with bare hands. It's a stark reminder that our capacity for physical aggression has really ancient roots.
But here's where it gets complicated and where I think the real insight from this material comes in. It's rarely just about the physical act itself. It's about the meaning we assign to it. The context is everything. We don't just universally condemn aggression. We absolutely hate the wrong kind of aggression.
But we celebrate the right kind.
Exactly. Like that quote from Ailey Wiesel the sources bring up. The opposite of love is not hate. Its opposite is indifference. You can feel this intense emotion for someone you deeply love or someone you deeply hate. And biologically, the state of intense love and intense hate can look surprisingly similar. It's the target and the context that define the meaning for us.
Okay, so that brings us to some really fundamental biology that shapes our immediate reactions.
Yeah.
The nervous system basics.
Yeah, you've got your sympathetic nervous system, the SNS. That's your gas pedal, basically.
Fight or flight.
Fight, flight, or yeah, the other two Fs they sometimes mention. It speeds up your heart, gets you ready for action, puts digestion on the back burner.
And then the parasympathetic nervous system, the PNS, that's the brake.
Rest and digest, calm, slowing things down.
Okay, so how does this link to behavior in maybe surprising ways?
Well, the sources highlight this really fascinating link to how you respond when you see someone else suffering. If seeing someone else in pain triggers your sympathetic nervous system, your SNS, you're probably going to focus on your own distress that results from that. You might freeze up, feel anxious yourself.
Right, overwhelmed.
But if it triggers your parasympathetic system, your PNS, you're actually in a calmer state. And in that state, you're potentially more able to focus outward and actually help the person. So your own internal biological state really shapes whether you turn inward or outward in that moment.
Wow, okay, so from those basic systems, let's move up to maybe the most complex bit of the brain when we think about sophisticated human behavior. The frontal cortex, often called the command center.
Yeah, though as the sources rightly caution, that's probably a bit too simple.
Right.
It's maybe more accurate to think of it as a critical interface. It's right between the ancient emotional limbic system and the rest of the higher cognitive cortex.
Wasn't there a neuroanatomist, Wallenota?
Yes, who controversially suggested it was almost like an honorary member of the limbic system because its connections to emotion are just so deep.
And one of the most, I think, relevant facts about the frontal cortex for understanding behavior, especially maybe certain age groups, is that it's the absolute last part of the brain to fully mature.
Yeah, we're talking mid-20s.
Mid-20s, which immediately gives you a kind of biological lens for thinking about adolescence.
Yeah, exactly. The frontal cortex is just crucial for self-discipline, for inhibiting impulses, for doing what the sources call the harder thing. It's kind of like a Calvinist superego, keeping urges in check.
But it's not always about conscious grinding effort, is it? This is where that idea of automaticity comes in.
Right. So tasks that initially demand huge frontal cortex effort, think about learning a complex piano trill or getting really good at a sport. They can become automatic over time. The control seems to shift to more reflexive brain regions, like the cerebellum, perhaps. You just do it without that intense conscious focus.
And the really profound insight here is how this applies to morality.
Yes. The sources suggest that some of the most demanding moral acts, diving into a freezing river to save a child, are always born out of careful, conscious frontal cortex deliberation. They can be mediated by this kind of automaticity, this ingrained habit of doing the right thing. People often say afterwards, I didn't even think, I just acted.
Like muscle memory, but for morals.
Sort of. And honesty, too, can become more of a habit, requiring less frontal effort over time if it's consistently practiced.
So, okay, the PFC is key for self-control, for making those hard choices, but it's also huge for social behavior.
Absolutely. The sources point out this correlation across primate species. The larger the average social group size, the larger the relative size of the frontal cortex tends to be.
And that link is especially strong in species with really demanding social lives, right?
Right.
Like chimps or bonobos.
Exactly. Those fission fusion societies where groups are constantly splitting and merging. Navigating all that complexity requires really sophisticated inhibitory control, precisely what the PFC helps provide.
And even within the frontal cortex, there are specialized areas. You've got the VMPFC.
The ventromedial PFC. That's the part Nada saw as closely tied to the limbic system. It's really about how emotion impacts your decisions.
And the DLPF.
The dorsolateral PFC. That's more about sort of cold cognition, rational processing.
And they use the trolley problem example for this, don't they?
They do. That classic, thorny moral dilemma. Flip a switch to kill one person, save 5. The DLPFC, that cognitive part, seems to be more active when people are considering making that utilitarian judgment, sacrificing one for the many.
So more DLPFC activation correlates with saying yes to flipping the switch.
That's what the research suggests, yeah.
And the PFC also regulates emotion, kind of like a thermostat.
That's a good way to put it. It inhibits the amygdala, that brain region we talked about earlier, the sort of alarm system.
Okay.
So the sources describe how after something like social exclusion, which really lights up the amygdala and pain regions in the brain, the PFC can step in with rationalizations.
Like telling yourself, this is just a stupid game, it doesn't matter.
Exactly. And that frontal cortex activity helps quiet down the amygdala's alarm bells.
Which brings us back to teenagers.
Right. With their still developing PFC, that rationalizing dampening effect isn't as strong. So when they experience social exclusion, the amygdala might stay highly activated, and the distress just builds and builds. It helps explain why those social situations can feel so devastating at that age.
Okay, so we've got structures for control for navigating social worlds. But where does the drive come from? The motivation?
Now we get into some really fascinating neurotransmitters, especially dopamine and serotonin.
Dopamine, often called the pleasure chemical.
Well, it's more nuanced than just pleasure. The dopamine system, particularly these pathways called the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways, they start deep in the brain, in the VTA, the ventral tegmental area. They're absolutely central to reward, yes, but also motivated pursuit. The wanting, the seeking of rewards.
And there's that interesting study mentioned where punishing people who are seen as jerks.
Yeah, that actually activates the dopamine system, especially if it costs you something personally to inflict the punishment.
So punishing norm violations feels good, satisfying.
It seems there's a kind of rewarding element to enforcing social norms, yeah?
And it's not just getting the reward, it's the anticipation, too.
Huge. The sources note that the dopamine release tied to anticipating a reward, that excitement before you get it, actually peaks when there's the greatest uncertainty.
Like a 50-50 chance.
Exactly. Around a 50-50 chance of getting the reward generates the most anticipatory dopamine, mostly in that mesocortical pathway going up towards the cortex. It suggests that dealing with uncertainty is cognitively complex, but also highly motivating.
Okay, so that's dopamine. What about serotonin? How does that fit into the picture?
Serotonin seems less about the go-get-it of dopamine and more about regulation, particularly impulse control.
So low serotonin isn't linked to, like, cold, calculated violence.
Right. No, not typically. It's more strongly linked to impulsive aggression and also cognitive impulsivity. Things like poor inhibition, difficulty thinking through consequences, and something called steep temporal discounting, which basically means you value immediate rewards way more than future ones, even if the future one is bigger.
Makes sense.
Low serotonin is also linked to impulsive suicide attempts, and studies show decreasing serotonin increases this kind of impulsivity. Conversely, increasing it can help individuals who are already prone to impulsivity, like, say, adolescents with conduct disorder.
Right.
But, interestingly, it doesn't seem to have the same calming effect on people who aren't impulsive to begin with.
So the brain's chemistry matters, the structure matters, but the brain isn't fixed, right? It changes. Neuroplasticity.
Absolutely fundamental concept. There's synaptic plasticity, how the connections, the synapses between neurons strengthen or weaken based on activity.
And glutamate is key here.
Glutamate signaling is crucial. You have different types of glutamate receptors. Some, the non-NMDA type, give a small response, a little zap of excitation.
Okay.
But if you get a long, strong train of glutamate signals hitting the synapse, it can activate these special NMDA receptors. They're nonlinear. Think of them like a gate that only swings open when things get really intense.
And when they open.
Boom! An explosion of excitation, as the source puts it. That massive influx of ions is critical for strengthening the synapse, forming new memories, essentially learning.
And it's not just tiny changes at the synapse level. There's bigger structural change, too.
Yes, structural plasticity. Learning a new motor skill can lead to new synapses actually forming in the motor cortex. Dendritic trees, those branches on a neuron that receive inputs, can physically expand with stimulation, like in the visual cortex or even the whisker cortex in rodents.
And stress hormones play a role here, too. Glucocorticoids.
They do, especially in the hippocampus, which is vital for memory. And it's complex. They have what's called an inverted U effect, meaning moderate short-term stress can actually increase connections, these things called hippocampal spines. But sustained high levels of stress cause them to decrease, to retract.
Which helps explain why chronic stress, like in major depression or anxiety disorders where glucocorticoid levels are often high, can actually lead to reduced hippocampal volume.
Exactly. It's a physical consequence of that prolonged stress environment on brain structure.
And then there are those really dramatic examples of brain reorganization, the axonal plasticity.
Yeah, these are amazing. In blind individuals who become highly skilled at reading Braille with their fingertips, neurons that would normally carry information elsewhere can actually sprout new connections, new axons, but project all the way to the visual cortex, the part of the brain that usually handles sight.
Wow. So the visual cortex gets repurposed.
In a sense, yes, it starts processing touch information from the fingers. Similarly, someone using an auditory device to see with sound can show activation patterns in their auditory cortex related to spatial information.
And there was that striking case study.
Oh yeah, the blind woman, an expert Braille reader.
Yeah.
She had a stroke that specifically damaged her visual cortex. And what happened?
She lost her ability to read Braille.
Exactly. Even though her fingers were fine, the rerouted neurons processing that touch information in her visual cortex were destroyed by the stroke. It's just incredibly powerful evidence of how experience can fundamentally reshape brain wiring.
The sources also mention adult neurogenesis, the birth of completely new neurons.
Right, mainly in the hippocampus and the olfactory bulb. This was actually a really controversial idea for a long time in neuroscience, but it's now generally accepted.
And guess what affects it?
Let me guess.
Stress.
Bingo. Chronic stress decreases neurogenesis too.
Okay, so the brain is plastic, it's dynamic, shaped by biology and experience. How does this all play out as we grow up? Let's circle back to development, hormones, the environment.
We already hit the late maturation of the adolescent frontal cortex, which, again, explains so much. But the sources point out other brain regions pitch during those years, like the ventral striatum, helping regulate emotions while a PFC is still, getting its act together.
And hormones are going wild then, too.
Totally. Estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, they're surging, and they are actively changing the structure and function of the adolescent brain, including keeping that developing PFC somewhat off-kilter.
And the reward system is different in teens as well.
It seems to be. The sources describe an exaggerated dopamine response to really intense, novel rewards. Big thrills feel amazing.
But sensible, maybe delayed rewards.
Might just feel, underwhelming. And this powerful drive for immediate, intense reward can easily overwhelm that still maturing prefrontal brake system.
A work of Lawrence Steinberg comes up here.
Yes, he found that adolescents often understand risks just as well as adults, logically speaking.
Right.
But they're much more likely to just toss that logic out the window when emotions are running high, or especially when they're around their peers.
Peer pressure is real, biologically.
It seems so. And interestingly, resistance to peer influence has been linked to a stronger response in that ventral striatum area we mentioned. Maybe better emotional regulation helps buffer against it.
Looking even earlier, you see stages in how moral understanding develops, like Piaget described.
Right. Very young kids don't really distinguish between intentional harm and accidental harm, or harm to a person versus breaking an object.
Those distinctions come later.
Yeah, typically around age 7 or so, along with the ability to express empathy more abstractly. And then later still, maybe around 10 to 12, you see more generalized empathy, but also, unfortunately, the emergence of negative stereotyping based on group identity.
And one of the absolute classic studies on early environment is the Harlow monkey experiment.
Oh yeah, iconic. It just demolished the old idea that infants bond with mothers simply because they provide food, the calories.
Harlow showed it was about comfort.
Absolutely. That soft cloth surrogate mother, even without milk, was far more important for creating that essential mother-infant attachment bond than the wire mother that only provided milk. Comfort over calories.
And the environment keeps shaping us. The sources get into media violence.
Noting that exposure does seem to increase aggression and the acceptance of aggression, particularly in children.
And it matters how the violence is shown.
Yeah, the effect seems stronger when the violence is portrayed realistically, maybe carried out by heroic figures, or when the viewers are younger children or girls. And the key seems to be the violent content itself, not just general arousal from watching something exciting.
Okay, let's wade into potentially the trickiest area. Genes and behavior.
Right. And the sources are, thankfully, quite careful here. Genes specify protein structure and function, yes, but they don't just rigidly decide behavior in a vacuum.
And most of our DNA isn't even genes, right?
Exactly. Only about 5% codes for proteins. The vast majority is non-coding, but that doesn't mean it's all junk DNA. It's involved in regulating those genes.
There's even this idea of neo-Lamarckian inheritance. Epigenetics.
Yeah, this is fascinating. It's about how environmental factors can change gene expression, whether genes are turned on or off without changing the DNA sequence itself. And crucially, some of these epigenetic changes can apparently be passed down to offspring.
So, acquired traits influencing the next generation. Lamarck wasn't entirely wrong.
Well, it lends some partial validity to his old idea, yeah. It's not wholesale inheritance of acquired traits, but environmental influences can leave heritable marks on gene regulation.
And the sources make a really crucial distinction about heritability itself.
Yes. The difference between a trait being inherited versus having high heritability.
Okay, break that down.
So having 5 fingers as inherited genes are obviously involved in that basic human plan, but the variation around that average, someone having 6 fingers or 4, has very low heritability. Because that variation is mostly explained by things like developmental accidents or rare genetic mutations, not common genetic variations circulating in the population. Heritability measures how much genetic variation accounts for the observed variation in a trait within a specific population living in a specific range of environments.
Ah, okay. So it's about explaining the differences between people, not the baseline trait itself.
Precisely. Which leads to the next critical point. Heritability estimates are always relative. They only apply to the environments studied.
So if you study people in more diverse environments,
the heritability estimate for a trait will generally go down because more of the variation you see will be attributable to those differing environmental factors.
And this leads to the biggest takeaway on genes and behavior,
which is that gene-environment interactions aren't just common, they are ubiquitous, and they can be incredibly dramatic. You simply cannot say what a gene does in isolation.
You can only say what it does in a specific context.
Exactly, what it does in specific environments.
And the mouse cocaine study example really drives this home.
It's truly stunning. You take genetically identical lab mice clones, essentially, raise them and test them in different but standard, reputable laboratories. They show wildly different behavioral responses to cocaine. The subtle environmental differences between the labs completely changed how their identical genes influenced their behavior.
Wow. So the gene doesn't have a cocaine response.
It has a cocaine response in Lab A and a different one in Lab B. The environment is part of the equation from the start.
And we see this with specific human gene variants too, like the MAOA gene, the so-called warrior gene.
Yes, another crucial example of interaction. The low-activity version of MAOA is sometimes linked to increased risk of aggression or criminality, but only if it's combined with specific environmental factors, things like experiencing severe childhood abuse, or having high testosterone levels, or facing social exclusion, or a major economic loss. Stress hormones and androgens also regulate MAOA activity directly.
So it's never just the gene, it's the gene in context.
It's always the interaction. And even when we look broadly with things like genome-wide association studies trying to find genes linked to complex traits like height.
What do they find?
They find that many hundreds or thousands of genes are involved, and each one typically has only a minuscule effect. Even the genetic variants with the strongest statistical link to height might only explain, say, 0.4% of the variation in height within the population studied.
So behavior is just incredibly complex, genetically speaking.
Massively complex. No single gene determines complex behavior.
There's even a mention of how certain gene variants are distributed differently across the globe, like the DRD47R variant.
Right. That variant is linked to things like novelty seeking and impulsivity, and it's significantly less common in East Asian populations compared to European or American populations.
And the sources kind of tentatively wonder.
Yeah, they raise the question cautiously of whether such population-level genetic differences might somehow relate to broad cultural differences, like the ones we're about to discuss, but it's emphasized this is a very complex and speculative area.
Okay, so that takes us very naturally to the power of culture and group dynamics. The environment shaping those gene-environment interactions isn't just physical, is it?
Not at all. It's deeply social and cultural. I mean, your entire life path can be vastly different just depending on the culture you happen to be born into.
And the sources spend some time on the individualist versus collectivist cultural framework.
Yeah, often using sort of East Asian and American cultures as common archetypes, though obviously it's a spectrum. Collectivist cultures tend to emphasize group harmony, interdependence, fitting in.
Whereas individualist cultures prioritize personal autonomy, achievement, standing out.
That's the general idea. And these fundamental value differences seem to shape moral systems too.
How so?
Well, in more collectivist societies, morality might be more closely tied to conforming to group norms. Shame letting the group down can be a more powerful emotional regulator than individual guilt. They might also lean more utilitarian in some judgments, prioritizing the group's well-being over an individual's.
And the sources mention a finding about empathy bias.
Yeah, some research suggests a potentially greater bias towards feeling empathy for members of one's own in-group in collectivist cultures. But individualist cultures have their own biases too, of course, often denigrating out-groups while boosting positive views of their own in-group.
And culture isn't just abstract values. Even the physical environment, like climate, can play a part.
It seems so. The need for long-term planning to survive harsh winters in some regions has been linked historically to cultural differences in planning horizons, and cultural tightness having very strict norms and strong punishments for deviating. That's been correlated with a history of facing collective threats, like frequent floods, droughts, or disease outbreaks.
And there's that stark link between El Niño and conflict.
Yeah, pretty striking. By causing severe drought and food shortages in vulnerable regions, El Niño events have been shown to roughly double the likelihood of civil conflict breaking out in affected countries in the following year. Resource scarcity fuels instability.
Then there's that whole debate about violence in the past. Tribal warfare rates, Hobbes versus Rousseau, basically.
Pretty much. You have the view championed by researchers like Keeley and Pinker that pre-state societies were incredibly violent places. They argue that the per capita death rate from warfare was actually far higher than even during the massive wars of the 20th century.
Kind of a bleak picture of the past.
It is. But then you have the counter-argument, which the sources also present. Critics argue that this view is often based on limited or potentially biased archaeological evidence.
And that it's been misused.
Yeah. That historically portraying indigenous groups as inherently savage served to justify colonization and land theft. So how we interpret that deep past has real present-day implications. It's a contentious area.
Shifting to cooperation, the sources look at hunter-gatherer groups.
And make a really important point. Within a typical hunter-gatherer band, maybe only around 40% of individuals are actually close blood relatives.
Which means?
It means cooperation within the group can't just be explained by kin selection helping people who share your genes. A huge amount of cooperation must be happening between non-relatives.
Which requires reciprocal altruism, tit for tat.
Exactly. That kind of cooperation among non-kin can evolve and be stable under specific conditions. You need repeated interactions. You need to be able to recognize individuals, remember how they behaved in the past.
And punish cheaters?
Crucially, yes. Punish those who take but don't give back. The classic prisoner's dilemma game models this, and the tit-for-tat strategies start by cooperating, then just do whatever your partner did last time turns out to be remarkably effective and stable.
Though it has weaknesses, like mistakes.
Yeah, signal errors are a problem. If you accidentally defect or misinterpret their move as defection, you can trigger this downward spiral of mutual retaliation.
So there are variations.
Right, like forgiving tit-for-tat or contrite tit-for-tat, which build in mechanisms to recover from occasional mistakes and avoid endless feuds. And we see evidence of these kinds of reciprocal exchanges all over the animal kingdom. Primates grooming each other, cleaner fish.
But how does cooperation get started in the first place? If everyone's defecting, the first cooperator just gets taken advantage of.
That's the puzzle. The sources suggest it probably needs to start with a small cluster of cooperators who interact primarily with each other, building trust and mutual benefit, allowing them to gain a foothold against the sea of defectors.
There's also a quick mention of mating strategies.
Yeah, just noting the general cross-species pattern related to parental investment. Whichever sex invests more time and energy in raising offspring, usually, but not always, the female tends to be the choosier sex when it comes to selecting a mate.
Okay, let's talk about us versus them. A universal human tendency.
Seems to be. We readily categorize people into in-groups and out-groups, but the key insight from the sources is that the categories themselves are incredibly malleable.
So it's not just fixed on race or nationality.
No. Depending on the context, your gender, your age group, even your profession or favorite sports team can become the salient US versus them distinction driving bias.
Which brings us to the contact hypothesis. Can contact reduce prejudice?
The evidence suggests yes. The sources cite a huge meta-analysis looking at hundreds of studies. The conclusion was that intergroup contact generally does reduce prejudice.
Especially under certain conditions.
Right. It works best when the groups have equal status in the situation, when they're working toward shared goals, and when there's some kind of institutional support or sanction for the interaction. And it works across all sorts of group differences: race, religion, age, sexual orientation.
And there's some really compelling real-world examples of this kind of bridge building, even in war. The WWI Christmas truce.
Yeah, a famous example. Soldiers spontaneously stopped fighting, shared greetings, even gifts. Though the sources add some nuance, it often required a bit of implicit top-down approval. It was facilitated by the shared cultural event of Christmas and often involved practical shared goals, like burying the dead. Little pragmatic needs created space for humanity. Even more striking, perhaps, was the live and let live phenomenon that emerged in the trenches over longer periods.
This was different from the truce.
Yeah, these were stable, unwritten truces that developed between opposing units without any official orders or even explicit agreements.
How did that work?
Soldiers just developed predictable patterns of non-aggression, like, we won't shell their lines during their dinner time if they don't shell ours, or tacit agreements not to fire at certain posts during certain hours. It seems to have been driven by mutual self-interest, nobody wanted to die, and maybe a slow, creeping sense of shared experience, even camaraderie with the guys just across no man's land.
That's incredible. The social environment also shapes us through hierarchy, through status.
Deeply. The sources mention, for instance, that countries with greater income inequality tend to have higher rates of pre-adolescent bullying,
suggesting that steeper, more brutal social hierarchies might trickle down.
It suggests that, that the nature of the hierarchy itself can influence how rank is enforced, even among kids.
And the link between stress and socioeconomic status, SES, is powerful too.
Hugely powerful. It's not just that poverty is bad for your health. There's a clear gradient. The lower down the socioeconomic ladder you are, step by step, the worse your average health tends to be.
And it's not just about access to doctors or bad habits.
Those play a role, but the sources emphasize they only explain maybe a third of the gradient. A huge part seems to be the chronic psychological stress of being lower on the ladder.
So it's about how you feel.
Yes. Subjective SES, how poor or well off you feel compared to those around you, can predict health outcomes just as strongly, sometimes even more strongly, than objective measures like income. And income inequality makes that gradient steeper. Low social capital, feeling disconnected, lacking trust seems to be a direct pathway.
And the types of diseases linked to SES.
Stress-sensitive diseases, things like cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, show the steepest gradients. It really points to the chronic stress of feeling poor, feeling marginalized, feeling a lack of control as being biologically corrosive over time.
And we see how group environment can change even seemingly fixed traits in that amazing baboon troop example.
Oh, the forest troop, yeah, where the most aggressive, high-ranking males selectively died off from eating tainted food.
And the whole troop culture changed.
Fundamentally, it became much less aggressive, more affiliative. And the crucial finding was that when new adolescent males transferred into this troop from outside,
They didn't bring the old aggressive ways back.
no, they assimilated into the new, more peaceful culture. They learned the local norms. It's just a stunning demonstration that even something like aggression level, which we often think of as an innate personality trait, is profoundly shaped by the social environment and how individuals are treated within their group.
Okay, let's pivot slightly and think about morality itself, maybe distinct from just general social behavior.
Right. And the sources reiterate that defining morality is tricky because, again, it's all about context and meaning, much more than the specific physical action.
And the interplay between intuition, our gut feelings, and reasoning.
Yeah, they're not necessarily opposing forces battling it out. The sources suggest they can be seen as two different ways the brain processes or frames a situation, sometimes leading to the same behavior, like protesting injustice, but maybe for different underlying reasons.
Joshua Green's dual process model is mentioned here, using the trolley problem again.
Right. His model proposes we have both these fast, emotional, intuitive responses, often linked to brain areas like the VMPFC we discussed, and slower, more deliberate, controlled reasoning processes linked more to the DLPFC.
And emotion often drives rule-based judgments, deontology.
Yes, that gut feeling of, it's just wrong to push the man, regardless of the consequences. While the more calculative reasoning might lead to a utilitarian judgment, sacrifice one to save five,
And damage to that emotional VMPFC region.
can make people more likely to endorse those utilitarian outcomes, yeah. Like being more willing to personally push someone off the footbridge in that version of the dilemma, because the emotional aversion is lessened.
Emotion, especially disgust, seems really tied into morality in this material.
Deeply. Particularly around concepts of purity or sanctity. The sources mention studies where just thinking about a past moral transgression can make people want to physically cleanse themselves.
And washing your hands actually makes you feel less guilty.
Apparently so. It's a fascinating link between physical purity and moral purity.
And Jonathan Haidt's work on moral foundations comes up.
He proposes these 6 core foundations like care harm, fairness cheating, liberty oppression, loyalty betrayal, authority subversion, and sanctity degradation.
And the idea is that liberals and conservatives prioritize these differently.
That's the finding, reported in the sources, presented neutrally. Liberals tend to place the highest value on the first 3. Care, fairness, liberty. Conservatives value those too, but also give significant weight to the latter 3, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And discussed sensitivity, for example, has been linked to how strongly people endorse those loyalty, authority, and sanctity foundations.
Let's loop back quickly to empathy. It's not always straightforwardly pro-social.
No, the sources offer a more nuanced picture. Feeling intense empathic pain, really mirroring someone else's suffering, can actually become overwhelming. It can lead you to focus on relieving your own distress, maybe by looking away or avoiding the situation, rather than helping.
And rationalization can get in the way, too.
Absolutely. Thinking, oh, someone else will surely help, or it's not my responsibility.
Yeah.
The bystander effect, that's another way our brains can prevent us from taking difficult, potentially costly pro-social action.
But we do see basic forms of morality or pro-social behavior in animals and young kids.
We do. Things like proactive attempts to lessen another's distress, reconciliation after fights. You see that in chimps, wolves, bonobos. Third-party consolation where an uninvolved individual comforts a victim.
And an equity aversion.
Yeah, that's the famous study where monkeys get upset if they see another monkey getting a better reward, like a grape instead of cucumber, for the same task. Dogs show it too. And in children, we see those developmental stages we mentioned, from basic emotional contagion to understanding intent, and later generalizing empathy.
And the neurobiology, what's going on in the brain during empathy or compassion.
The anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, seems involved. It's active when you feel your own pain, but it also activates when you see others in pain, suggesting a role in that emotional contagion.
But its core function might be self-focused.
The sources lean that way, suggesting that ACC's fundamental role might be more about monitoring outcomes, including others' outcomes, primarily for how they might affect you. Learning from others' pain to avoid it yourself, for instance. True compassionate caring for others might be a more complex layer built on top of that self-monitoring system.
Other areas involved.
The VMPFC again, theory of mind areas that help you understand others' perspectives, and the hormone oxytocin plays a role, famous from studies on pair bonding and prairie voles. Mirror neurons are sometimes mentioned as a candidate mechanism for empathy, the idea that watching someone else activates the same neurons as if you were doing it, but that's still quite speculative.
Which brings us back to that perennial question. Are truly selfless acts possible biologically?
From a strict biological or evolutionary perspective, the sources argue most acts of cooperation or altruism probably contain at least an element of self-interest, even if it's indirect. Like building reciprocal debt, you owe me one. Enhancing your reputation, which brings future benefits, getting that internal warm glow feeling, avoiding guilt, or even pleasing a watchful, moralizing God. The fact that the ACC's core function seems rooted in monitoring outcomes for the self kind of fits this perspective.
Finally, on morality, there's this concept of sacred values.
Yeah, work by people like Scott Atran and Robert Axelrod. These are core values that define a group's identity. They're non-negotiable.
And defended fiercely.
Disproportionately so, often regardless of material costs or consequences. Attempts to offer material trade-offs or compromises on sacred values are often seen as deeply insulting because you simply can't put a price on them. Understanding these is obviously crucial for navigating many real-world conflicts.
Okay, as we head towards wrapping up this deep dive, let's touch on conformity, obedience, and maybe the potential for change.
Right. The Milgram obedience studies, the Stanford prison experiment, despite all the methodological debates around them over the years, they still provide these stark, unsettling demonstrations of how readily ordinary people can succumb to situational pressures and authority figures, engaging in behaviors they'd likely condemn in others or themselves under normal circumstances.
And just following orders actually changes brain activity.
The sources mention research suggesting it does, yeah. Brain activation patterns look different when someone feels they're acting under orders compared to when they feel they're making their own choices. A sense of diminished agency, perhaps.
The sources also draw a line between forgiveness and reconciliation.
Yes, using the powerful example of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, after apartheid.
Its main goal wasn't necessarily individual forgiveness.
No, the primary aim was national reconciliation, finding a way for the country to function, to move forward, to avoid wider civil war, which it largely succeeded in doing. But for many individual victims, forgiveness remained elusive, often because perpetrators showed little genuine remorse or didn't offer apologies.
So reconciliation can happen at a societal level, even without full individual forgiveness.
That's the key takeaway. Reconciliation is often a social or political process, distinct from the deeply personal process of forgiveness.
And I think it's powerful to bring back that baboon troop example here one last time.
Absolutely. Because it serves as such a potent reminder that even seemingly fixed personalities or ingrained behavioral patterns, like the level of aggression in those male savanna baboons,
aren't set in stone.
Exactly. They aren't universal or inevitable. They were profoundly shaped by the specific culture of that troop and how individuals were treated within it. It offers real hope, I think, showing that change, both individual and collective, is possible and heavily dependent on the environment we create.
Just a quick technical note from the appendices and sources reminding us about hormones versus neurotransmitters.
Good point. Different chemical messengers, different scales. Hormones are like slow, widespread broadcasts through the bloodstream, minutes, hours, days, affecting many targets.
Whereas neurotransmitters are fast, point-to-point messages across tiny synaptic gaps, milliseconds.
Both absolutely crucial for behavior, just operating on different time scales and ranges.
And throughout all of this complexity, the sources really stress not oversimplifying brain function.
Vitally important. It's almost never correct to say one single brain region is the center for some complex behavior, like aggression or love or morality.
Functions are distributed, right? Emergent from network.
Exactly. It's better to use phrases like a region plays a key role in or helps mediate a behavior. And also be careful to distinguish between studies that damage the cell bodies in a region versus those that damage fiber tracts just passing through it. They tell you different things about connectivity.
Okay, so this whole exploration brings us right back to that really deep philosophical discussion the sources raise about free will.
Yeah, the danger of what they call determinism du jour. Meaning latching onto the latest neuroscience, finding, oh, this brain region lit up, and immediately concluding that behavior is completely predetermined and choice is an illusion.
The sources argue that's too simplistic.
They do. They point out that many neuroscience findings are descriptive or correlational. They show what the brain is doing when a choice is made, but don't necessarily disprove the concept of choice itself.
There's that philosopher mentioned, Hilary Buck.
Right, who suggests that saying someone chose an action doesn't actually conflict with saying that action resulted from complex neural processes. It's just redescribing those same neural processes using a different level of analysis, the language of agency and intention.
And the sources even touch on really difficult examples like pedophilia and the role of potential biological predispositions.
Does a biological predisposition mean someone is destined to act on harmful urges? Or does choice, that struggle to do the harder thing that the frontal cortex enables despite biological pulls, still have a meaningful role to play? These are profoundly difficult ethical and legal questions with no easy answers.
So wow, we've covered a huge amount of ground in this deep dive. We've seen how human behavior is just this incredibly intricate tapestry.
Woven from threads of biology, right down to neurons and molecules, shaped by our development, our long evolutionary history, deeply influenced by our culture, our group dynamics.
And all expressed within the immediate context of the environment, both physical and social.
And the real challenge, as the sources consistently emphasize, is trying somehow to hold all these different levels of analysis in mind at the same time when we try to understand ourselves and understand others, especially when we're grappling with behavior at its best and at its absolute worst.
And stepping back, really thinking about these interacting forces, from the automatic unconscious processes up to the cultural norms we inherit, really can start to change how you view the world and maybe your own actions within it. And that leaves us with a pretty powerful, maybe even unsettling final thought to consider. Given how much of what we think, feel, and do is shaped by forces like our genes operating within specific environments, the hormones surging through us, the cultural scripts we absorb almost without thinking, and these deep-seated unconscious processes, processes that influence everything from our automatic moral reflexes to stress-induced selfishness or the groups we instinctively trust or distrust. Where exactly does that leave room for conscious choice? For that feeling that you, the conscious self, deliberately chose to overcome those pressures and do the harder thing? And maybe more importantly, how does grappling with all this complexity influence our capacity for understanding, perhaps for forgiveness, or for believing in and working towards change, both in ourselves and in others?
Yeah, that's definitely something worth mulling over long after this deep dive ends.